I still remember the day my life turned upside down. My name is Terry, and I'm 22 years old. Just a few months ago, I lost my father, my only family left after my mum passed away when I was a kid. It was sudden, unexpected, and it hit me hard. I wasn't prepared for life without him. The grief weighed me down, and I felt adrift, like I had nowhere to go. That's when Arthur stepped in. Arthur had been my dad's best friend for as long as I could remember. He was always around, at family barbecues, Christmas dinners, and every major moment of my childhood. He's 51 now, but you wouldn't guess it from looking at him. Arthur has that timeless kind of masculinity, well-built, tall, with salt and pepper hair that only makes him look more distinguished. He's the kind of guy who commands attention when he walks into a room, and even as a kid, I could see how much my dad respected him. They were more like brothers than friends. After my father's death, Arthur reached out to me, offering his home as a place to stay while I figured things out. I hesitated at first. After all, I didn't want to impose, but honestly, I didn't have many options. I didn't have a steady job, and my savings wouldn't last long. Arthur insisted, saying that my father would have wanted him to take care of me, and that's how I found myself living in his house. It was weird at first, staying with someone who was so close to my dad, but Arthur made it easy. He was kind, understanding, and never made me feel like a burden. And that's where it all began. Moving in with Arthur happened faster than I expected. One minute I was packing a few bags, and the next I found myself driving to his place, a beautiful, spacious house in the suburbs, a far cry from the cramped apartment I'd been barely affording. Arthur had always been well off. My dad used to joke that Arthur had a golden touch when it came to business. I knew Arthur ran a successful real estate company, but he wasn't one of those flashy, show-it-all types. His house, though large and elegant, felt lived in, cozy even. It was clear from the moment I stepped in that this was a home, not just a place to sleep. The first night was surprisingly comfortable. Arthur gave me a guest room down the hall from his own and told me to make myself at home. He didn't hover, didn't push, just let me settle in at my own pace. I had imagined that being around him would stir up constant memories of my dad, but it didn't. Arthur had a calming presence, like he understood what I was going through without needing to say much. He just knew how to be there without making a big deal about it. I needed that more than I realized. The more time I spent around Arthur, the more I began to notice things I hadn't seen before. For one, he was incredibly private. He worked from home most days, but always kept his office door closed, and I never asked what he was doing in there. He never really talked about his personal life either. I knew he'd been married once. My dad had mentioned it when I was younger, but Arthur's wife had left him years ago. From what I gathered, it hadn't been an amicable split. She moved on quickly, while Arthur seemed to have chosen solitude. He never dated, at least not that I knew of, and there were always whispers around town about him. People had talked, mostly in hushed tones, that Arthur might be gay. I'd heard those rumors growing up, but I never paid them much attention. To me, Arthur had always been just my dad's best friend, someone I looked up to. But now, living under the same roof, I found myself wondering if there was any truth to those rumors. Not that it bothered me. In fact, it didn't faze me at all. Over the last few years, I had come to terms with my own identity. It had been a slow, confusing realization, but by the time I was 18, I knew I was gay. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even my dad before he passed. It wasn't that I was ashamed. I just didn't know how to bring it up, how to let people in. So I kept it to myself, buried beneath layers of silence and uncertainty. But living with Arthur, seeing how he moved through life without ever explaining himself to anyone, gave me a strange sense of comfort. It made me think that maybe I didn't need to announce my sexuality to the world, that maybe it was okay to just be. As the days went on, Arthur and I settled into a routine. We'd eat dinner together most nights, watch TV, or just talk. He never pried into my life, never asked uncomfortable questions, but he was always there, like a quiet, steady force. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to those moments when it was just the two of us, talking about everything and nothing at all. He didn't treat me like a kid, and that was refreshing. He treated me like an equal, like someone whose thoughts and feelings actually mattered. Despite the comfort of living with Arthur, there was still this undercurrent of tension, not the kind that made things awkward or unbearable, but the kind that simmered just beneath the surface, leaving me wondering about things I couldn't quite put into words. There were times when I'd catch him looking at me in a way that made my stomach twist, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me question things. Maybe it was the grief talking, or maybe it was something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to our relationship than just him being a surrogate father figure. And then, of course, there were the moments when I found myself thinking about him in ways I shouldn't. Arthur was 51, yes, but he was in incredible shape. He worked out almost every day, either going to the gym or jogging around the neighborhood, and it showed. His body wasn't just fit, it was sculpted, strong, and it exuded the kind of quiet confidence that only comes with age and experience. I couldn't help but notice, even though I tried to push those thoughts out of my head. After all, he was my dad's best friend, practically family, and I was just a kid compared to him. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't mind those thoughts. In fact, I started to embrace them in a way. Maybe it was because I was finally allowing myself to accept who I was, my attraction to men, my desire for something real, something different. Or maybe it was because Arthur, with all his mystery and strength, represented everything I wanted but couldn't have. At least, that's what I thought. Life outside of Arthur's house wasn't easy. After my dad passed, things had started to fall apart. I was barely holding on to my job, working part-time shifts at a cafe, scraping by with just enough to pay for my phone bill and some groceries. Living with Arthur helped relieve some of the financial stress, but it didn't change the fact that I felt stuck. I didn't know what direction I wanted my life to take, and honestly, I was still grieving. The loss of my dad had left this massive void, and I hadn't figured out how to fill it yet. Arthur, though, never made me feel like I was a burden. He was like this anchor, keeping me grounded while I tried to navigate the mess my life had become. He didn't judge me for my lack of direction, never pushed me to figure it out. Instead, he just quietly supported me in his own way. He'd offer to help with small things, like covering a bill or giving me advice when I wasn't sure what to do about a problem at work. He didn't push his opinions on me, but he was always there, offering guidance when I needed it most. It was during this time that I started to notice things about Arthur I hadn't really considered before. He was more than just my dad's friend. He had become something like a mentor to me, a protector. But there was this undeniable physicality to him that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. Arthur was disciplined, waking up early every morning to hit the gym or go for a run. I would hear him leave before I was even out of bed. By the time I shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, he was back, fresh from his workout, muscles still tense beneath his t-shirt as he made his breakfast. I couldn't help but watch him sometimes, the way his arms flexed as he cooked, or the way he'd towel off the sweat from his forehead. It was hard to ignore how fit he was, how his body seemed to defy the typical image of a man in his 50s. There was this raw masculinity to him, this energy that made him seem powerful, controlled. Every move he made seemed deliberate, like he was completely at ease in his own skin. One day, I couldn't help myself. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was lounging in the living room when Arthur came back from the gym. He was wearing a tight, sweat-soaked tank top that clung to his chest and back, showing off the hard lines of his body. I hadn't even realized I was staring until I heard him walk upstairs to his bedroom, and for some reason, I followed. I didn't know what I was expecting, but as I passed by his slightly open door, I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror. Arthur was standing in front of his dresser, pulling off his tank top, revealing the kind of physique that you only saw on men half his age. His back was broad, muscles rippling under the skin, and I could see the veins on his arms, the way they bulged slightly with every movement. I froze, completely captivated by him. He tossed his shirt aside and then, as if sensing me, turned his head. Our eyes met in the reflection, and my heart jumped into my throat. I immediately tried to act casual, pretending like I was just passing by, but I knew he'd caught me. I felt the heat rise in my face as I mumbled something about going downstairs and practically fled back to the living room. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way he looked and how my body had reacted to seeing him like that. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was something deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. What made it worse was that Arthur hadn't said anything. He didn't mention catching me staring, didn't bring it up at dinner later that night. It was like it never happened. But I knew, deep down that it had changed something between us. I started to notice more after that. The way he'd look at me sometimes, a lingering glance that made my pulse quicken. The way his presence filled the room whenever we were alone together, this unspoken tension growing between us. I couldn't tell if it was all in my head or if Arthur felt it too. He was always so composed, so hard to read, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken between us, something waiting to happen. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Friday, and I'd just come home after a particularly grueling day at work. Arthur was in the kitchen, cracking open a couple of beers, and asked if I wanted to watch the football game with him. We hadn't done something like that in a while, just the two of us, hanging out like friends, and honestly, I needed the distraction. I was stressed, exhausted, and the idea of sitting down with him, having a beer, and losing myself in the game sounded perfect. We sat on the couch, side by side, watching the game, drinking beer after beer. As the night went on, the conversation turned more casual. We laughed, joked about random things, and for the first time in a while, I felt the heaviness of my grief lift. It was just me and Arthur enjoying the moment. But as the game drew to a close, I noticed the way Arthur had inched closer. Our shoulders were almost touching, and I could feel the warmth radiating off his body. He turned to me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen before, his eyes lingering on mine a little too long. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, and suddenly his lips were on mine. I froze for a split second, my mind racing, but then something inside me clicked. I didn't pull away. Instead, I kissed him back, letting myself get lost in the moment, in the feel of his lips on mine. It was like all the tension, all the wondering, had finally come to a head, and everything I'd been holding back rushed to the surface. He pulled back slightly, his breath warm against my skin, and whispered, "Drop to your knees." There was no hesitation, no second guessing. I found myself sinking to the floor in front of him, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked up at him, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place, desire, need, maybe even something more. And then I did what he asked, without a word, without question. In that moment, everything changed between us. The next morning, things were different. Or maybe they weren't, and it was just me overanalyzing everything. After what happened the night before, I expected some sort of awkwardness, some tension hanging over us like an unspoken secret. But Arthur didn't act any differently. He was up early as usual, already dressed and halfway through his coffee by the time I made it downstairs. I could feel my heart pounding as I walked into the kitchen, still replaying every second of what had happened between us. The way his lips had felt against mine, the heat of his body, the way I had dropped to my knees for him like it was the most natural thing in the world. It had been surreal, exhilarating, but now, in the bright light of morning, I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Did Arthur regret it? Did he see it as just a drunken mistake? I had so many questions, but I didn't dare ask any of them. Arthur looked up from his newspaper as I entered the room, giving me a casual nod. "Morning," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. There wasn't a hint of anything unusual in his demeanor, no sign that what had happened the night before had even registered with him. "Morning," I mumbled back, trying to act just as nonchalant, even though my insides were a swirling mess of confusion and nerves. I grabbed a mug and poured myself some coffee, all the while stealing glances at him out of the corner of my eye. He seemed normal, unfazed, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. At least it had for me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the feel of his hands, his body, his voice telling me what to do. The way I'd responded so easily, without a second thought. And now, standing in the same room with him, it was like a switch had been flipped inside me. I wanted more. The thought hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. But how could I bring it up? What would I even say? "Hey Arthur, about last night, can we do that again?" It sounded ridiculous in my head, and the last thing I wanted was to make things weird between us. After all, Arthur had been there for me in ways no one else had. He'd taken me in, given me a place to live, supported me when I was at my lowest. The last thing I wanted was to screw all that up because of some confusing, out-of-nowhere feelings. So I didn't say anything. I just went about my morning like everything was perfectly normal, even though my mind was racing. Arthur didn't mention it either, and for a while, I convinced myself that maybe he'd forgotten, that maybe it was just a one-time thing, a heat-of-the-moment decision we'd both move past. But I couldn't move past it. Not really. The next few days were a blur of routine, work, coming home, eating dinner with Arthur, and watching TV in the evenings. It was almost like we'd fallen back into the same rhythm, like nothing had happened. But that tension, that unspoken energy, still lingered between us. I felt it every time we were in the same room, every time our eyes met for just a little too long. It wasn't until a week later that everything shifted again. It was late on a Friday night. I had just gotten back from another grueling shift at the cafe, feeling exhausted and frustrated. Arthur was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up when I came in, his eyes locking onto mine, and I felt that same spark I'd felt the first time we kissed. That pull, that invisible force drawing me toward him. "You look like you could use a drink," he said, gesturing to the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. I hesitated for a moment, but then I shrugged off my jacket and sat down next to him. He poured me a glass, and we sat there in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our drinks. The warmth of the alcohol spread through my body, loosening the tightness in my chest, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. We didn't talk much at first, just sat there, side by side, staring at the muted TV as the night stretched on. But as the whiskey continued to flow, the silence between us began to feel heavier, charged with something unspoken. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about how it had felt to kiss him, to touch him. And now, sitting so close to him again, I realized I wanted more. Eventually, Arthur broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and serious. I swallowed, my heart racing. "Yeah." He turned to face me, his eyes dark and intense. "About last week, what happened between us." There it was. The thing we hadn't talked about, finally out in the open. My mouth went dry as I nodded, unsure of what to say. I could feel the tension building between us, the air thick with anticipation. "I don't regret it," Arthur said, his voice steady, but there was something raw in the way he looked at me. "But I need to know if you feel the same way, if you want this." It was like the floodgates opened. All the thoughts, the feelings I'd been pushing down for the past week, came rushing to the surface. "I do," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I've been thinking about it ever since." Arthur's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something vulnerable in him. Something I hadn't expected. He leaned closer, his hand reaching out to touch my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. "Then come here," he whispered. This time, I didn't hesitate. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and before I knew it, we were kissing again. But this time, it wasn't just a drunken, impulsive moment. This time, it was deliberate, slow, filled with a hunger that had been building for far too long. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, our bodies pressed against each other, the heat between us undeniable. It wasn't rushed, wasn't frantic like the first time. It was different, more intimate, more real. And when it was over, when we were lying there in the aftermath, the silence between us wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like we'd crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. I knew then that this wasn't just a fling, some passing attraction. This was something real, something I didn't want to end. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. But deep down, I knew that everything had changed. I wanted more, and now I wasn't afraid to admit it.